Thank you very much for that introduction, Peter. Thank you very much for the opportunity and the privilege of speaking at this conference. As you've heard, I do come from the United Kingdom, and those of you from Australia and New Zealand have possibly been watching some of the developments over the Murdoch affair in the United Kingdom. Have you watched that, picked up a little bit on that? And did any of you watch any of the evidence that the Murdochs gave to the Select Committee? Well, in which case, let me just say that the work I'm about to give you is only 1% of my overall output, and therefore I can't reasonably be held accountable for what it is that I'm about to say. I wanted to look at several themes. First, to recognise that in much of the discussion that we're having over the next 2 days, there is an inherent normative dimension. For me, it's framed in the context of quite a significant scale of anti-politics in the popular culture of many of our countries. And then, if we're talking about solutions, we need to recognise that there's no such thing as an average citizen. We need to develop audits and tools that are capable of coping with and embracing that diversity. And then recognise designing the right solutions is likely to be quite a matter of judgment because you're trying to mix together different factors. And then I want to end with a plea to take democracy seriously. So those are my 6 themes, and I'm going to try and get through it all in about half an hour in order to enable us to have some discussion at the end. Well, there's different ways in which you could try and characterise the different models of democracy. But a broad distinction that David Held has put forward in his book on models of democracy is between those that offer a more protective framing of the issues of democracy and those that offer a more developmental framing. And hopefully this will be something which will be reasonably familiar to most of you, in the sense that democracy can be understood as simply a competition between elected leaders with organised group engagement. And that understanding of democracy was in part built out of a kind of fear of the problems over engagement of the citizens. What you needed to do was construct a form of democracy that in effect held back mass citizen engagement but gave people enough engagement and enough participation to feel that they were able to influence the system. And its goals were to protect liberties, both the liberties of property and the liberties of human rights, and to construct stable government. But there always was and is another tradition in relation to democracy, expressing democracy and understanding it as much more as a fundamental human right, that you would have a right to have a say over things that affect you, and seeing engagement as absolutely central because it builds better human beings, it builds a better society. And looking to deliberation in order to give the fullest expression of people's citizenship as they learn from one another and learn to share their understanding of problems and potential solutions. And the goals of that model are to create legitimate and effective outcomes, but stemming from shared learning and exchange of interests and ideas. So there are these 2 fundamentally different models, and we shouldn't assume that the choices that we'll be making over the next couple of days and in our subsequent work are normative free. This is a normative influenced zone. And in effect, one can see the tension immediately in the title that I've been given, because Westminster and the Westminster model of governance is much more in tune with the protective model of democracy, whereas the idea of, I think, stake-centric engagement is much more in tune with the developmental model of democracy. So actually, at the central part of what it is that we're looking at over the next couple of days, there is a fundamental shift, as it were, from one understanding of democracy to another understanding of democracy. And these are the reasons why these issues are quite often difficult to resolve, because in effect, much of what we've been trying to do over the last 2 or 3 decades is graft the developmental model of democracy onto a protective model of democracy, and the result has been a certain amount of confusion and certainly a certain amount of tension. These tensions then find a much wider set of expressions. The most obvious is the debate between whether we prioritize representative forms of democracy or whether we prioritize direct or participative forms of democracy, whether we recognize fully the impact and importance of the growth of critical and challenging citizens. One of the features of survey work, when you look back in almost all of our countries to the 1950s, not that there were so many surveys there, but there are some, and you can compare the data with later years. One of the key features is the rise of critical and challenging citizens, more citizens interested in politics and claiming an interest in politics now than 4 or 5 decades ago. Their engagement and their involvement in politics has become less formal, less through formal institutions, less through parties, less through formal organizations, and more in a fluid sense through single-issue politics, but more generally through the internet. But at the same time, politics itself has tended to become more centralized. There's much more focus on leaders, and the personalization of politics has become a key feature. And then that's run alongside various constitutional trends which are encouraged more pluralism and more devolution. At the same time, you have an increasing focus on the professionalization of politics. So many politicians don't have any other experience in their lives other than being professional politicians. But at the same breadth, you get people talking about whether or not we can create a political system where our representatives are more socially representative in some kind of way. All of this in the spotlight of a 24-hour media framing, focused much more on soundbite democracy, but then matched at the same time by the growth of civic journalism and the internet as a way of putting forward alternative news arguments and alternative news agendas. So I'm not surprised we're spending at least a couple of days discussing these issues, because the developments of the last 3 or 4 decades have been ones where there have been contradictory and challenging developments. And the final issue that I want to talk about in terms of the two models is, well, how are they broadly responding? And I think the reasons why we find that the Westminster model is a little bit nervous about citizen engagement is precisely because, from a protective perspective, you would tend to be a little bit cautious and a little bit concerned about how far you can push a citizen-centric model of decision-making. But undoubtedly, the Westminster model is feeling the pressure that is reflected in the increasing demands and the increasing challenges coming from citizens themselves. From a developmental model, there are some positive and reform-minded things that you can talk about. There are some fantastic examples of change that you can point to as well. But there is also the spectre of utopianism, designing forms of participation and engagement that really don't fit with the way that people can realistically live their lives. So in terms of the two broad models, both in a sense are in trouble at the moment, and both need to go through a period of rethinking. And that rethinking has to take place in the context of a very stubborn anti-politics. There is a lack of trust in key political institutions. I just looked at the most recent Eurobarometer data from 2010, which covers all 27 countries of the European Union. You just take one simple question, which is about whether people tend to trust various institutions or tend not to trust, and you take one from the other. The European Union ends up with a negative of -5%. National governments end up with a negative of -35%. And national parliaments end up with a negative of 31%. But I'm not sure I need to labour the point too much for this audience that perhaps politics is not universally admired in our societies. But I will just point out that it is a worldwide feature. So this is some interesting work that Pippa Norris has done, looking at the World Value Survey. And again, just based on a simple mixing of two questions, asking people about how important they rate democracy as against their satisfaction with the way that democracy is actually practiced in those countries, you can see that across the world, as it were, that there is a kind of overall gap between the relative importance of democracy and the satisfaction with the performance of that democracy, with some of the greatest dissatisfaction being expressed in North America and Western Europe, reflecting, one assumes, both the higher levels of expectation in relation to democracy and the importance placed on democracy in those countries, but a sense that it's not fully delivering. So I think we can say that although we'd want to, in any learned paper, point out that there's much variation and that there's a possible exception if you look at the Nordic countries in terms of this trend towards, or this established feature of disengagement with politics. But really, I think you could argue it's been a core feature of the way in which people have been thinking about democracy for now 3 or 4 decades. So it's not a new thing. It's not a product of an immediate set of factors. It's very much ingrained in the way that people seem to be thinking about democracy. And in many ways, I think it might reflect a wider feature of democracy, that democracy, because it's a form of collective decision-making, inevitably tends to disappoint because of the nature of the democratic promise, which is the democratic promise is a right to have an engagement in issues, but not a right to have the issues decided in your favour. And I think that there are other features as well that you could point to in terms of the way that politics inherently works, in terms of its compromises, from its less than total grasp of the truth in exchanges, that you might argue would create issues in terms of people's sense that democracy, and particularly the politics that delivers democracy, is somehow flawed. But other than that, you probably point to 3 other factors. One is the role of the media, in terms of the way that the media frame politics and political choice, often in a very negative and dumbed down manner. The breaking down of the control and influence that political parties have had over partisanship and over the way in which people think about issues. I noted in some newspaper article that I read over the weekend that those factors are perhaps less developed in Australia than in other liberal democracies, but nevertheless it is a feature of the Australian system. And perhaps also it reflects a greater sense of a performance delivery stretch, which is that perhaps we now expect more from government itself, but that capacity to deliver is inherently stretched by the tendency for governments to get into all kinds of things that perhaps they previously wouldn't have got involved in. For example, we've all been slightly bemused in the United Kingdom by David Cameron's recent interest in trying to make us all happy. And the idea that happiness should be a metric against which governments want to measure their performance is stretching towards insanity as far as I'm concerned. So, established the idea that we're in a normative debate here, established the idea that it's a difficult debate because of the sense of anti-politics. Let's just go on to the third of the themes, which is there's no such thing as an average citizen. The way I wanted to frame this is just simply to say to you, is apathy a choice? Of course, you can't be bothered to answer. Of course, in some senses, it is, in that any rational person would be apathetic about some of the issues that they are confronting. And the posh term that in political science we have to describe that is intensity of preference. People clearly care about some issues and don't care about other issues. And given that governments deal with literally thousands of issues in any one week, if you're an average citizen, to have some variation in your intensity of preference would only be logical. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that people don't express an interest in every single issue that government identifies for discussion and debate. But if it was simply just a choice, if apathy was a choice, then what I suppose we'd expect is that across the spectrum of society, we wouldn't find evidence that there were some people that were participating to a much lesser